Good morning. Right, today we're going to write our narrative texts. A narrative text, remember, is just another way of saying a story, essentially. So you're using familiar themes, so we're talking about those traditional stories and fairy stories, but changing them up. Correctly punctuating speech, which we looked at yesterday, and using those fronted adverbials and conjunctions, which we use all the time to open our sentences, extend our sentences, and things like that. Right, so what have we been planning this week? We have been planning our own version of fairy stories, but changing something about them, mixing them up with another story, doing something to make them different to the original story. They should not be the same as the original story. The story has to change. So have a look at your plans. Which part of the original story did you keep and which parts have you changed? Now you've looked at those plans, it's time to write your story. Remember, whilst you are writing, to keep looking back at your plans. Look back at the speech which we did yesterday. Look at the success criteria for today's lesson and try and make sure you include everything. Before you write, I thought you might like to hear a story that I wrote where I kind of mixed two stories together. Once upon a time, there was an egg and his name was Humpty Dumpty. One day, Humpty Dumpty was strolling through a verdant green forest. In the trees the birds were singing, whilst newborn lambs gambolled in nearby fields. At that very moment, Humpty felt he was the happiest little egg in the whole wide world. Unfortunately, his happiness was to be short-lived. Whilst whistling a merry tune, Humpty continued on his ramble through the countryside, and eventually began to feel a little hungry. "Time to eat my packed lunch," he said to himself, and to the butterfly fluttering around his face. Looking around for somewhere to sit, Humpty Dumpty spotted a wall. It was, he thought, a little high, but it looked easy to climb and wide enough to sit upon. Carefully, Humpty climbed the wall. The grey stone was dry, and his eggy feet gripped easily. After less than 2 minutes of climbing, Humpty Dumpty found himself sat on the wall. Meanwhile, a full complement of cavalry guards were practicing manoeuvres. The king's horses and the king's men worked together perfectly. Almost silently they moved in squares, changed formations, and prepared for imaginary attacks. Presently they came to break for refreshments. "Sir?" asked a young corporal. "Yes, Corporal Jenks," replied the commanding officer. "Do you see on that wall over there? It looks like an egg eating its lunch," pointed out the corporal. "By golly, you're right!" exclaimed the CO. "It looks like that idiot Humpty Dumpty. We'd better get over there and check if he's safe." With that, the CO ordered all his troops to advance on Humpty's location. But they were to be too late. Atop his wall, Humpty Dumpty was admiring the view. As he looked to the distance, he saw a flock of geese, a beautiful flock of geese, flying in a perfect V formation towards him. He admired the birds as they flew closer and closer. As they began to fly overhead, he leant backwards to see them. Being an egg, and therefore having no neck, Humpty was obliged to bend back from the knees. Fascinated by the birds, Humpty leant back further and further and further until his little legs could support him no more. Before Humpty realised what was happening, his egg body was tumbling down the wall. As time slowed in his mind, he wondered if he would survive such a great fall. Splat! Humpty hit the ground. His shell cracked into 100 pieces, and his yolky innards began to spread around him in the short grass. At that moment, all the king's horses and all the king's men arrived on the scene. "Help!" murmured the mortally wounded Eggman. "Quickly!" ordered the commanding officer. "Put him back together again." For hours the military surgeons laboured over the stricken Humpty Dumpty, but to no avail. In the end, it was reported that this egg was truly fried. Sinking into his saddle, the CO thought long and hard. "Well," he said finally, "you may not be able to put him back together again, but I know a man who can. Men, collect the fragments of this forlorn ovoid. We ride for the castle of Dr. Frankenstein." The already rotting scraps of egg and slowly desiccating albumen were scooped into a large jar and loaded onto a cart. The cavalry unit then began the march to the mountain retreat of the famous scientist, Dr. Frankenstein. As they rode on, tall mountains rose to flank the path. At their peaks, snow still covered the rough and rugged rocks. Occasionally, the soldiers would hear the bleat of a mountain goat or the screech of an eagle. After a day's ride, they arrived at the castle. Its dark stone walls rose vertically from the mountainside, and the only entrance was via a heavy wooden door. At the top of the highest turret, a curious set of antennae and other strange structures reached skyward. The commanding officer, dismounting his horse, stepped towards the door. With his gloved and armoured hand, he rapped 3 times on the door. "Frankenstein, it's me, the Major. We have need of your aid," he called out. Slowly, the door opened, and stood within was a small man in a white coat, his hair wild and singed. "I know why you are here," he said softly with a hint of an accent. "Bring him in." Carefully, the soldiers carried Humpty's jar up to Frankenstein's laboratory. There he was unpacked and laid out on the doctor's table. "We are forecast storms tonight," said the doctor. "This is good." Piece by piece, Frankenstein glued, stitched and stapled Humpty's shell back together. When the body was whole again, he poured in what was left of Humpty's eggy insides through a hole he had left at the top. Much had been lost, so Frankenstein topped Humpty up with a strange green bubbling fluid he poured from a steel barrel. Finally, the stricken Eggman was strapped into a chair from which wires and cables reached to a great electrical contraption of dials, levers and switches, and then on, upwards to the ceiling of the room. "Now be ready for the storm," said Frankenstein. Night fell swiftly in the mountain, and storm clouds began to gather. The distant sound of thunder drew closer as the doctor made adjustments to his machine. Finally, the storm was upon them. Lightning struck the conductors and coursed through the machine and into the wrecked body of Humpty. His eggy frame convulsed as he was filled with frightening power. Suddenly, Humpty's eyes opened wide and wild. He ripped off the shackles that bound him and leapt from the table, his face a contorted grimace. "I am the Eggman!" he cried. Lightning flew from his fingers towards the gathered soldiers and Dr. Frankenstein. "You are the Eggmen!" he screeched. As the lightning wrapped around the assembled throng, they began to change, their bodies growing rounded, their faces sinking down into their chests until they were as egg-like as the monster before them. "I am the Walrus!" wailed the Humpty creature triumphantly, as long tusks grew from his mouth and long whiskers sprouted from his face. With that, he bounded from the room, down the stairs to the courtyard and out of the castle doors, never to be seen again. Now, many years later, if you were to travel to those misty European mountains, perhaps you would hear a story told to children to scare them to bed. Beware the toothy, eggy man. He will catch you if he can. He'll turn you to an Eggman too, and that will be the end of you. So that was my story. Right, time for you to write yours. While you're writing, or when you've written, show somebody where you have used some correctly punctuated speech. Show somebody where you have extended a sentence using because or until. Show somebody where you've used a fronted adverbial. Get those stories done. You can either do them in your books or I will set a blank template on Purple Mash. And I look forward to seeing what you come up with. See you soon.